We're super happy to host two of our own, Joshua Cole and Jeffrey Weinlinger, discussing lethal provocations, anti-Jewish violence in French Algeria and Ukraine. And we decided to put together this panel because Professor Cole just has a book that came out on French Algeria, and Professor Weinlinger is completing a book on the pogroms of the Russian Civil War. And we thought that this was a great occasion to think comparatively about these types of events, that violence, what's different, what might be similar, and for us to think more comparatively about this across the continent and across time as well. So the format is slightly different. What we want to do is have Professor Cole give a lecture, basically a book talk, and then we'll have Professor Weinlinger come in and offer comments about this and bring in his own take on the issue based on his research on the Ukrainian case. And then we'll open to the floor and have a discussion about this. But first, I will introduce our speakers. They need no introduction, but they deserve one. So Joshua Cole is professor of history here at the University of Michigan. He specializes in the social and cultural history of France in the 19th and 20th centuries, as well as in colonial violence and the politics of memory in France, Algeria, and Germany. He's the author of Power of Large Numbers, Population, Politics, and Gender in 19th Century France, published in 2000, and the co-author of Western Civilizations, published by Norton in 2019. His latest book, Lethal Provocation, The Constantine Murders and the Politics of French Algeria, was just published this fall. Jeff Weinlinger is the Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies and Director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. He's the author of the award-winning books, The Moscow State Yiddish Theater, Jewish Culture on the Soviet Stage, 2000, Jewish Public Culture in the Late Russian Empire, 2009, and In the Shadow of the Shtetl, Small-Town Jewish Life in Soviet Ukraine, 2013. And he's currently working on completing a book anytime now on the pogroms of the Russian Civil War. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Weinlinger and Joshua Cole. And Josh first.
Yeah. Thank you, Geneviève, and thanks to all of you for coming. I know there's lots of events this week, and it's great to have you here today. So I've written a book about a riot that took place in the city of Constantine in French Algeria in August 1934. Muslim crowds attacked Jews in the city and several surrounding. Can you hear me with the lapel mic? Is that good? Yeah, okay. Muslim crowds attacked Jews in the city and several surrounding towns. 28 people died, 25 Jews and 3 Muslims. Now, these numbers make this the most lethal episode of anti-Jewish violence on French territory during peacetime in the modern era. But curiously, at least 2 books on anti-Semitism in France have been, on anti-Semitism in France in the 1930s, have been written that do not mention this event. It's not that it has been forgotten. Jewish families in France remember this event very well, and historians have written about it. But it has somehow been removed from the frame because it took place in Algeria, as if this fact requires a different treatment, a different order of explanation. And my book seeks to place this event back in the frame. I want to see it as a riot in France. So let me start by pointing out that the Algerian Jews and Algerian Muslims who died on August 5th in 1934 all possessed French nationality. It's easy to forget this because of the dramatic cascade of events that happened later. By 1937, a mass-based nationalist movement emerged in Algeria. Eventually, this movement would achieve independence after 8 years of bitter war in 1962. The Second World War brought US troops to North Africa and a collaborationist regime to power in Paris. After 1948, tensions between Muslims and Jews throughout the world became acute because of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian catastrophe. In 1962, at the moment of Algeria's independence, the French settler population, nearly 1 million people, left North Africa to remake their lives in France. And Algeria's Jews also left in 1962. 90% of them went to France, and about 10% went to Israel. Today, virtually no Jews live in Algeria. Now, my point is that in 1934, when the Constantine riots occurred, nobody knew that all this was going to happen. And as we will see, the violence in Constantine broke out largely because of the possibility that both Muslims and Jews might be included in the French polity on equal terms. This bears repeating. The riots took on their contemporary meaning in the context of a debate about reforming the colonial system, not ending it. My initial goal was to understand the politics of this forgotten moment when the social relations engendered by colonialism were not yet transformed by the realization that they might soon come to an end. And I was also attracted to this story because it seemed relevant to France's contemporary crisis. Attempts in the 1930s to reconcile the generous promises of French republicanism, liberty, equality, fraternity, with the violent exclusions inherent in colonial society seemed familiar to me as a researcher who had spent a good number of years living and working in France since the early 1980s. Debates about the rights of religious minorities, about racial discrimination, anti-Semitism, discrimination against Muslims, social unrest, the threat of violence, etc. All these contemporary issues divided French society in the last decades of the 20th century and still do today. In the early 2000s, when I first started writing about these debates, it was still considered provocative to insist that this political polarization was connected to lingering questions about the French Republic's colonial legacy. If racism existed in contemporary France, so the argument went, it was because the principles of the eternal republic were being violated. To suggest that the republic itself had been shaped by exclusions of race and religion was troubling, provocative, because it seemed to awaken within the present lines of social and political conflict associated with the bitter violence of decolonization. And eventually I realized that the question of provocation was part of what I was working on. What is it about the history of France's Republican Empire that makes evocations of difference so provocative? In the book, I define provocation as a form of verbal or physical attack that is designed to draw attention to perceived differences in such a way as to heighten or escalate a sense of conflict between them. I argue that provocations are not just manipulative acts or utterances, but powerful forms of performative action and meaning that help to create the very reality that sustains them. People attacked in the name of difference have no choice but to respond in ways that affirm the significance of those differences. This makes provocation a very interesting subject for historians. They're like a thread you can pull in order to understand the complicated patterns of association and differentiation that are at the heart of any society, the things that pull them together and the things that tear them apart. In the most general sense, my book is about the way that provocative acts can transform the way that people relate to one another, making certain kinds of social and political conflict seem inevitable, obvious, taken for granted, without the need for explanation, even murder. So let me tell you the story with some background elements to make it legible. The French conquest of Algeria began in 1830. It was a French settler colony until 1962. After 1848, Algeria was legally and institutionally a part of French civil territory, a part of France. At the moment of the conquest, Algeria was a complex society, about 3 million people, already well integrated into the Mediterranean economy. The conquest was a catastrophe for Algerian people at many levels. After several decades of settlement and the imposition of a new property regime that favored recent arrivals from Europe, Algeria suffered a famine that claimed 800,000 lives in the 1860s. Add to this the further 800,000 Algerians who died during the decades of conquest and subjugation, and the total human losses by the closing decades of the 19th century surpasses 1.5 million people. Before the conquest, the population of Algeria was remarkably diverse. It included Muslims of various religious schools, Sephardic Jews that traced their heritage to medieval Spain, so-called Berber Jews whose presence predated the arrival of Islam in North Africa, people of Turkish descent, enslaved people from sub-Saharan Africa, city dwellers, rural dwellers, wealthy people, poor people, speakers of different dialects of Arabic and Tamazight, the so-called Berber languages. In port cities, one could hear as well snippets of Maltese, Italian, Spanish, and French. Under the French, after 1830, all of this diversity was swept into one legal category, the native, the indigène. By 1900, European settlers amounted to just 10% of the population, but they controlled 80% of the colony's GDP. The Muslim population, 90% of the total population of about 4.6 million in 1900, controlled 20% of the colony's wealth. Constantine, a city in eastern Algeria, is a provincial capital about 80 kilometers from the Mediterranean coast, not too far from the Tunisian border. By the first decades of the 20th century, the city was divided into a European quarter. You can see here the Place de la Brèche. Some of the events I'm going to talk about occurred on this street that goes off this place, there, the Rue Nationale. And the older neighborhoods that retained their traditional character. This is the Rue Vieux in the heart of the old Jewish quarter. Out of a population of about 100,000 people in the 1930s, just over half of the city's population were Muslim, about 34% were French settlers, and about 13% of Constantine's population was Jewish. So, in 1837, when the French armies besieged the city, Muslims and Jews fought together on the city's walls to repel the invaders. But after 1870, Algeria's Jews were granted full citizenship in the French Republic. They voted, they ran for office alongside French settlers in local and parliamentary elections. They sent their children to French schools. They adopted European forms of dress. Muslims, on the other hand, were subject to a harsh penal code, paid a disproportionate share of taxes relative to their share of economic activity, and their culture was despised by the growing settler population. Literacy rates among Muslims, probably higher than literacy rates in France in 1830, declined after the French invasion. Although they were the majority population in Algeria, they did not have parliamentary representation. After electoral reforms in 1919, a portion of the Muslim population could vote, male population of course, could vote and hold office, but only in local assemblies. Muslim voters voted in a separate electoral college, and the number of seats that Muslims could hold in these assemblies was limited to 1/3 of the total. In other words, the system was rigged against any chance that they could gain a majority by themselves. Meanwhile, the Crimea Decree, which gave Algerian Jews French citizenship in 1870, was detested by the French settler population. It was seen as a violation of the distinction between Europeans and natives. If Algerian Jews could vote, politics in the colony no longer mapped cleanly onto the essential divisions of colonial society between natives, quote, and Europeans. And this situation generated an anti-Semitic backlash from the settler population that reached a fever pitch during the Dreyfus Affair in the 1890s, which you perhaps are familiar with, an episode of extreme anti-Semitism within the French Republic. In Algeria, political clans in the settler community that sought the control of municipal budgets and the lucrative patronage networks that were associated with these budgets found that they could use anti-Jewish rhetoric as a stepping stone to political power. This was the context that produced the political career of Émile Morineau, who was the mayor of Constantine and also a deputy in parliament in 1934 when the riot broke out. You can see his parliamentary career had two phases, 1898 to 1902, and that he lost an election in 1919 to 1940. Morineau embodied the political ethos of the settler establishment. First elected in 1898 on a strongly anti-Semitic platform, He first tried to keep Jewish pupils from registering at public schools. He attempted to exclude Jews from various programs of social assistance. He lost his parliamentary seat in 1902, however, when the wave of anti-Semitism that he had ridden so successfully subsided after the Dreyfus affair. In consolidating his local power base after this loss, Morneau did a remarkable about-face. He formed a political alliance with local Jewish leaders. The fact that Jews in Constantine found such an alliance expedient is a good indicator of how vulnerable they felt to be from anti-Jewish agitation. And why would Morneau do this? He could count. Jews in Constantine were only 13% of the total population, but the exclusion of Muslims from voting rights, that is, about half the population of the city, meant that Jewish voters constituted a much larger percentage of voters in parliamentary elections, about 25%. And Morneau's cynical change of attitude worked. By the 1920s, he was re-elected to parliament with Jewish help, and he became a reliable supporter of Constantine's Jewish population. By the 1930s, however, the political environment had changed again. On the right, anti-Jewish, anti-communist, and fascist leagues began to gather support from the middle class, especially the Croix de Feu, the Fiery Cross, an authoritarian veterans organization that had a wide following in France and a wide following in Constantine. This is a sticker that was found in a town just outside of Constantine in the early 1930s, and it shows the symbol of the Croix de Feu, the death's head medallion, as the vaccine to the poison offered by the Communist Party in France. This is those polarizing years in the run-up to the Second World War. In metropolitan France, this left-right split was the defining characteristic of political life in the 1930s, the background to a head-spinning few years that witnessed an abortive right-wing coup in February 1934, when fascist leagues rioted in Paris, a Popular Front victory of the left in 1936, only 2 years later, and the emergence finally of a right-wing collaborationist government under the German occupation in 1940. And there was another layer of complication in Algeria. By the early this is a poster of the Popular Front, anti-fascist agitation within the city in the early 1930s. Notice the printer is Attali. In the riot that I'm going to talk about later, the Attali home was one of the homes that was invaded, and 5 people were killed, including the printer Attali's 2 children were killed in the riots. So, I said, left-right polarization in France characterized political relationships in the 1930s, no surprise there. But in Algeria, and in Constantine in particular, there was another complication, which was this new cohort of Muslim politicians that entered local politics after the electoral forms that followed the First World War. And I want to emphasize that these men were not Algerian nationalists. Mohammed Ben Jelloul, this man here, was the president of the Federation, I'll say it in English, the Federation of Muslim Elected Officials. This was the most active body of Muslim elected officials in Algeria as a whole. He was an elected member of the Departmental Council, that's the sort of regional council in eastern Algeria. And Ben Jelloul's main goal was to gain parliamentary representation for Algeria's Muslim population. He wanted into the system. He didn't want out. I have a nice picture. The photographer at this event took a portrait of them before Ben Jelloul spoke, and then wonderfully, he sat behind him and took a picture of Ben Jelloul speaking before the crowd of his electors. All right, this then was the complicated political context of the riots in 1934. A settler establishment with both a history of anti-Semitism and alliances of convenience with Jewish voters. A polarized political landscape in metropolitan France that pit left against right in a bitter decade characterized by political extremism and street violence. An emergent cohort of Muslim political figures who were not nationalist, but rather assimilationists. Ben Jelloul's main goal was to be an insider. And in Algeria, a fluid situation in which political identities did not map cleanly on the primal division between Europeans and indigènes, natives, that was perceived to be so essential to the colonial order. Now, this situation produced tensions on the streets, and in fact, in my book, I have 2 chapters on street relationships before the riots. I argue that this violence was not inevitable. Interethnic violence of this nature emerges from a complex combination of contingency and human choice. And what's most interesting about the run-up to 1934 is that provocations, attempts to engender violence, including provocations attempting to engender violence between Muslims and Jews, were plentiful enough, that happened quite frequently, but they usually did not work until they did. And I'll tell the story of 1934. The trouble began on a Friday, August 3rd, and of course in a Muslim society, Friday is a very important day for both Muslims and Jews in the preparation for the sort of peak of the religious week. A drunken Jewish man, a soldier in the reserves, insulted several Muslim men through the open window of a mosque as they washed themselves for their evening prayers. This was the first provocation, though there was disagreement about who provoked who. The argument between this Jewish man who'd been drinking, and the men in the mosque led to several hours of angry confrontation between Muslims and Jews in the neighborhood that grew progressively more violent. Attempts by the mufti of the mosque to quiet the crowd failed, and a large crowd later gathered before the Jewish man's apartment later in the evening. When soldiers arrived after dark, members of the crowd shouted, "Vive la France!" Long live France, indicating perhaps that they assumed that the soldiers shared their anger at the Muslim man who, at their Jewish neighbors who they were angry at. By the time that police and soldiers succeeded in clearing the streets, after there was kind of several hours of brawling on the streets, a Muslim man had been shot in the stomach by an unknown assailant. There's a story connected there, but I don't have time to tell you. He would eventually die 3 weeks later. News of his lingering agony in the civil hospital spread through the town, further angering Muslims in the city. The next day, Saturday, Jewish and Muslim leaders met with each other in their own homes. They didn't retreat to their respective corners. They actually came together to speak and meet with one another. And they met with the authorities in order to prevent further violence. And there's a story here about the events, but I can't go into the details here. The local chapter of the International League Against Anti-Semitism distributed a poster pleading for calm. And here we have the text, right? Muslim comrades, an individual showed a lack of self-control. Jewish comrades, Muslims and Jews have always lived side by side. Common interests unite us to them. This was also circulated in Arabic. It was printed up quickly. I can't actually prove that this was printed by the Atali printer, but I suspect that it is the case because he was often printing up the material for these these kinds of organizations. These efforts to calm the situation failed. Late in the afternoon on Saturday, word had gone out that Mohammed ben Jalloul, the elected official from Constantine, whose picture I showed you earlier, word went out that ben Jalloul had called for a meeting just outside the city on a hillside clearing known as Les Pins. And this is, the bridge at Alcantara. This is the old city across the gorge. The city is on this gorge. And this is an outlying town connected called the Faubourg d'Alcantara, where there was the gasworks and the railway station. And then there was this wooded hillside at Mansoura, where there was this area called the Pines, Les Pins. And the idea was that the people heard that ben Jalloul was going to hold a meeting here early on Sunday morning. The prefect refused to give permission for ben Jalloul's meeting at Les Pins. I should add that this is an older photograph. At the time, there was another suspension bridge across the gorge on that far end, just so you'll see that picture later. This is the best picture I could get for Les Pins, the pines. So the prefect refused to give permission for ben Jalloul's meeting at Les Pins, but the next morning, a crowd began to gather there anyway. And told by a messenger that Ben-Jalul was not coming, the crowd dispersed, and groups of people began to go back down the hillside and to cross the bridge. At that moment, a more malicious provocation occurred. Unidentified men ran toward the bridge from the city's main street, the Rue Nationale, shouting that Ben-Jalul had been assassinated. And at approximately the same moment, further provocations took place at a market square, the Place des Galettes, right near the Jewish quarter. Several Jewish women were clubbed in the face by unknown assailants. Groups of armed Jewish men on the street fired shots as crowds gathered. The situation deteriorated rapidly, and it led to violent attacks on Jewish homes and businesses in the city that lasted for a period of about 8 hours. So this is rioters on the Rue Nationale that connects that bridge that we saw to the central square on the other side of the town. I have a photo that shows actually a man performing the act of provocation for the benefit of the camera. I think I have a story about this picture too, but I can't prove it. You can see surrounded by members of a crowd who look much more uncertain than he does. It's this interesting photograph. The police and the military remained strangely passive, limiting themselves to crowd control on the main thoroughfares, attempts to control fires. Only late in the day did they try to clear the side streets, and only late in the day were they given orders to distribute cartridges to the forces. When a car carrying the chief of police and other officials approached the suspension bridge, see there's the suspension bridge there, at Sidi Messid in the late afternoon, they encountered a group of men stopping cars on the other side of the bridge. They had unfurled a banner that read, "Vive la France," long live France. This indication of the atmosphere and sentiments on in at least a part of the crowd was something that the authorities did their best to avoid talking about in the riot's aftermath. So, as I said before, in all, 28 people died that weekend, 25 Jews and 3 Muslims. This shows the street where the Attali family lived, the printer. This arched doorway on the left is the doorway that goes up to their apartment where the Attali family lived. As I say, 5 people were killed in that apartment. 8 people died in another home just around the corner. You see that break in the street there? If you go that way, around the corner, there was another home invaded, the Halimi family, and 8 people from 2 families were killed in that apartment. 5 more Jews were murdered in 3 nearby businesses. 2 more were killed in adjacent streets. 1 Muslim man was shot to death before hundreds of onlookers in a central square. Several more Jewish deaths occurred as the unrest spread to outlying villages, and a Muslim boy was shot in the stomach in a nearby town. He died 2 days later. So this is a map. You can see the traditional Jewish quarter was in this corner of the city. What's interesting is that the initial provocation at the bridge happened simultaneously with the provocation near the Place des Galettes at around 9. But the first murder here happened before that had happened, and the rest of the murders all occurred in this very tightly circumscribed neighborhood, which was not really the traditional Jewish quarter. It was a neighborhood that had been changed by the penetration of this street that the French had built with French-style apartments, and more prosperous Jews had moved into this neighborhood. This area was traditionally a non-Jewish Algerian neighborhood. People refer to it sometimes as the quartier indigène. And this is where all the murders occurred. And note that the deaths began in that area roughly simultaneously with the provocations in other neighborhoods. In the immediate aftermath, both the local police and Jewish community leaders asserted that the riots had been planned ahead of time and provoked by a group of conspirators. Within days, the police seemed to confirm this when they leaked information to the press about the arrest of a, quote, gang of throat slitters who were allegedly responsible for many of the deaths, including the 2 home invasions. The arrested young men were butcher shop employees, and the press reported that they had confessed to killings at more than one address. It's clear that the interrogations of these young men were brutal. In the subsequent trials, all the accused recounted that they had been beaten before confessing to the police. As the investigation progressed, however, the Governor General's office intervened in the police work, and the leaks to the press stopped. There was something about the story of the gang of throat slitters and the manner in which the details were being made public that troubled the political leadership in Algeria. After the Governor General's intervention, the police changed their story and stopped talking about conspiracy and the quote, gang of throat slitters. Instead, they came up with a separate list of perpetrators for each address where Jews had been killed. These lists provided the basis for the trials that took place in July 1935 and February 1936. Some of the individuals originally accused as being part of this gang remained on this list, but they were only accused of murders in one location. And this is what's weird about this, some of them had actually confessed to murders in one location, and the one insisted that he had committed a murder over here, but he ended up being charged at another house where there was a witness who was willing to identify him as being present. Meanwhile, the official investigating commission appointed by the Governor General of Algeria interviewed dozens of officials and eyewitnesses, and they dismissed all claims of conspiracy and provocation as unfounded. And instead, the commission blamed the riots on the, quote, religious fanaticism of the Muslim population of Constantine, while also suggesting that Jews bore a measure of responsibility for having provoked, that word again, the anger of Muslims. The trials, which took place in 1935 and 1936, were carefully stage managed to confirm this account. There were separate trials for each location where murders occurred. None of the accused was charged with murders in more than one location, even, as I said, in cases where they had confessed, and had been reported in the press, to murders that were in more than one place. The proceedings were dominated by a small number of local lawyers, established members of the establishment, I gotta rewrite that sentence, sorry, who argued that there was really only two ways to understand this event, and one they called the Muslim Thesis, and the other was the Jewish Thesis. The Jewish Thesis held that the riots and murders had been planned beforehand and executed by an organized group. The Muslim Thesis was presented as a claim about a spontaneous local dispute that had gotten out of hand. In every case, the trial's outcome, there were half a dozen trials, the trial's outcome confirmed the Muslim Thesis. The Jewish Thesis was attributed to the paranoia of an aggrieved minority, and in this way the legal proceedings managed to imply that the debate about the riot's origins was simply a continuation of the conflicts that occurred on the street on August 5th. Now, I have uncovered evidence that the authorities actually knew more than they revealed publicly. And this is a document. I can talk more about it if we have time, but maybe I'll just finish this here. The police came to believe that the riots had been provoked by an agitator named Mohammed El-Mahdi. El-Mahdi was a soldier in the French army who the police connected to a prominent lawyer and an elected official in Constantine, Etienne Muracioli. Muracioli was a well-known ally of the mayor on the local councils, and he played an important role in the murder trials in 35 and 36. He was present at almost every one, sometimes representing Muslim defendants, sometimes representing Jewish families as civil parties to the trials. So military documents, this is, I have a picture of Mohammed al-Mahdi. I'll show it in a minute. Military documents place al-Mahdi at the site of the Atali home invasion, where 5 people were killed on August 5th. And they, in fact, place him there at the precise moment that the killings were taking place. This also places him near the sites of those other killings that I showed you. El-Mahdi himself appeared as a witness for the prosecution for the murders at the Atali home. So he's there at the trial, but he's testing, and Muracioli is one of the lawyers who's helping to present this trial. And in this trial, he was represented as one of the first soldiers who burst through the door while the killers were still present. Etienne Muracioli served as a lawyer representing the family of the victims at the same trial. The appearance of these two men at the trial poses many questions about what people knew at the time about al-Mahdi's actual role. And I conclude from a wide range of evidence that Muhammad al-Mahdi and a small group of co-conspirators may have been responsible for as many as 20 of the 25 Jewish deaths in Constantine on August 5th. And there's more. Where did I get a picture? Is that it? What happened? Where's my tech person? I think he has to. There we go. Okay, there's Muhammad al-Mahdi. He was no ordinary conspirator. He's actually a notorious figure in the history of political extremism in France, later well known to the French police as a member of a violent terrorist organization that unleashed a campaign of assassination and bombings in France in 1937 and 1938. This right-wing network, known in the contemporary press as the Cagoule, brought together militants from French nationalist leagues who sought authoritarian or fascist solutions to France's political crisis in the 1930s. The Cagoule's most notorious figure, the assassin and terrorist Jean Filiol, recruited al-Mahdi into the organization. He was arrested in 1937 in connection with this. He was detained for 10 months and then released without being charged. During the Second World War, al-Mahdi became an enthusiastic supporter of the French collaboration with the Nazis and a propagandist for Vichy's anti-Semitic campaigns. He finished the war in the SS. He was, in fact, a recruiter and commander of a brigade of Algerians who fought with the Germans against the French resistance. But I want to be very clear about something here. Muhammad al-Mahdi was a French Muslim man who was not an Algerian nationalist. He was, in fact, a third-generation French citizen by birth. Both of his parents and both of his grandfathers were also French citizens. One grandfather, married to a French woman, served in the French army. His other grandfather and his father held offices in the colonial administration. Al-Mahdi himself studied at the Sorbonne in the early 1920s before enlisting in the French army. He fought in the Rif War in Morocco, and he remained in the army until 1937. He was present in Paris during the abortive right-wing coup attempt in February 1934. So given his subsequent history under Vichy, it's important to recognize that al-Mahdi's anti-Semitism was linked to his embrace of an extreme form of French nationalism that was also viciously anti-Jewish. His engagement in 1934 was not an expression of a specifically Muslim anti-Semitism. Sometime in the early 1930s, he became involved with right-wing militants who advocated violent attacks on the Third Republic and leftist politicians. His participation in the murders of August 1934 marked an important step in his political evolution toward a form of fascism with deep roots in the history of French colonialism. Because al-Mahdi's participation in the Constantine murders remained unknown to most people, contemporaries blamed the city's Muslim population as a whole for the murders on August 5th. It also meant that Mohammed ben Jalloul's campaign to gain parliamentary representation for Muslims in the French Republic was tainted with the stain of murder. This was al-Mahdi's goal. He and his co-conspirators assumed that the riots and murders would drive Muslims in Algeria to forge a bond with French nationalists by encouraging a shared hatred of Jews. This was precisely the story that the Governor General's office was so anxious to conceal. The fact that a French soldier in uniform on the streets on August 5th was implicated in the murders could not be revealed to the public. The possibility that he was connected with right-wing French extremism was explosive. It was preferable to blame the allegedly atavistic and primitive conflicts between two populations that could not supposedly tolerate one another and assert that the riots had nothing to do with France. This was, in fact, the conclusion of the official investigating commission in a report that was never published in full at the time. My book argues that this claim is wrong. Frenchness was a moving target in Algeria in the 1930s, and the riots had everything to do with complex battles that were being fought in France's name. When he was arrested in 1937 for his activities in the Cagoule, Muhammad al-Mahdi announced to his interrogators, I love France very much and ask only to serve her. And in a political manifesto that he wrote in 1943, when he was working with the Vichy regime, he expressed bitterness that his struggles on behalf of French nationalism had not been recognized. He attributed this to an anti-North African prejudice that came from the settler population itself, which did not appreciate his willingness to participate in their political projects. In his manifesto, he envisioned an alliance of what he called the superior Aryan races of Europe with the superior Berber races of North Africa, a Eurafrican form of fascism, and that word was his, Eurafrican. In this 1943 manifesto, El Mahdi himself cited the riots in Constantine as a misunderstood act of French patriotism. Speaking of this settler establishment's attitudes towards Algerian Muslims, he wrote, "They call us dangerous agitators and hateful anti-Europeans. Once the threat to their interests becomes clear, they take this step. For them, everything is a pretext. The events of Constantine, August 5th, 1934, provoked by the abuses and insolence of the Jews, will be deformed and presented to public opinion as an infringement on French sovereignty, even though these pogroms were carried out to the accompaniment of people shouting, 'Vive la France.'" That's El Mahdi's own words, written in 1943. So in the long run, El Mahdi's provocations, like his later engagement as a foot soldier for Vichy and the Nazis, were failures. His hopes that Muslim Algerians could be recruited to the cause of a right-wing French nationalism remained unfulfilled. His dreams of a Eurafrican fascist alliance in the Second World War found few supporters. And I should say, it's important to say here, that El Mahdi never had a mass following. But nevertheless, the murders that El Mahdi helped to organize in Constantine terrorized Algerian Jews and permanently tainted any discussion of political reform in Algeria. I actually think that political reform in Algeria probably wouldn't have succeeded anyway. But after the murders committed on August 5th, the ethno-religious boundaries in Constantine and Algeria as a whole seemed to harden into implacable blocks. The political experiments that crossed the boundaries that separated European from native became much more difficult to sustain. So let me sum up. The conventional wisdom about this event holds that the violence of August 1934 was the natural and inevitable result of the hardened ethno-religious boundaries that were already a part of North African history since before the French conquest. I argue the opposite. This period was characterized by many political experiments that crossed the boundaries separating Jews from Muslims, French from indigène, European from Algerian. The goal of these experiments was to make some form of Frenchness in Algeria more inclusive. And there was actually more than one version of Frenchness at stake here. These experiments, for the most part, were detested by the French right, and they sought to provoke violence in order to make them fail. And it worked. The murders committed on August 5th hardened the boundaries between ethno-religious communities after the fact, and made further political experimentation that much more difficult. So, an extraordinary amount of work went into the construction of this moment as an Algerian event rather than a French one. For the local political establishment, this work was more important than anything else. It was more important than commemorating the dead. It was more important than finding justice for the families of victims. It was more important than remedying the inequities of the colonial system that were implicated in an explosion of hatred that killed 28 people. Because of this work, it is just as hard for historians today to talk about the riots in Constantine as it was for contemporaries in the 1930s. The violence took place in an Algerian city that now seems far from France. Jews no longer live there. The Algerians who do face their own challenges with the violent history of decolonization in the 20th century. The political complexities of the French Empire's fragility in the interwar years and its failed efforts to imagine a world in which Muslims and Jews could be simultaneously Algerian and French have been understandably overshadowed by the dramatic events that took place in the decades that followed. This is the story of a terrible event that unfolded in the harsh glare of imagined futures that never arrived. That's it. So, okay, yeah, I'll go sit down.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is I will comment a little bit on Josh's work for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And I'll kind of comment in reference to the work that I've been doing on anti-Jewish violence in Ukraine. So first I want to say I really enjoyed reading this book. It's an absolutely astounding book. It was recently awarded a National Jewish Book Award, by the way, just last week, so congratulations on that. And it really is just an amazing work, and the work that went into gathering this material. I have to say, reading it, I felt very envious. I felt envious for a few reasons. One, just the level of analysis that you're able to do and the way you write and the way you put it all together. It's just really amazing. I was also envious that the French were able to document it in such great detail, and the work that the police did and the amount of materials that you have, whereas the pogroms that I'm working with, also there's a lot of material, but nothing like what you've got. So I'm envious of that. And most importantly, I'm envious that you were able to write it while sitting in Paris and working in archives there. So it's really a fantastic achievement. And I got thinking as I was reading it about the comparisons between what's going on in Algeria, the anti-Jewish violence that we have in Constantine, and the anti-Jewish violence that I've been studying in Ukraine. So, in the beginning of the book, on like page 7 or something in the introduction, you didn't say it in the talk, but you mentioned that it's not really a classic pogrom. And I just want to say I think it is a classic pogrom. The term pogrom means a wide variety of things. It really first entered the English language in 1881 in reference to a string of anti-Jewish violence that took place throughout the south of Russia, in an area that maybe we would call today Ukraine. And in those pogroms, in which several hundred different towns were hit, most of them began similarly. They began with drunken bar brawls between Jews and Christians, and then they spread through the neighborhood. Then there were also agitators. There were also ultranationalist agitators who came around and went down the rails and stirred up violence in the towns. And they were also motivated primarily by the quest for loot, which you didn't mention all that much in this case, but it's certainly much of what you're describing as a quest for loot. And they're motivated by that with really very few fatalities. In the entire 1881, 1882 pogroms, which in Jewish historiography are regarded as a major turning point in Jewish history, about 20, 23, 24 people were killed. So in all those pogroms, the same number essentially as were killed in that one in Constantine. There's then another wave of pogroms of anti-Jewish violence in Russia between 1903 and 1906. That begins with the Kishinev Pogrom, in which 49 people are killed, so a larger one. And that also comes about as the result of unrest taking place, of the revolution of 1905, the Russian-Japanese War, breakdown of authority. And in the one pogrom in Kishinev, about, as I said, 49 people are killed. There's about somewhere between 600 to 700 separate pogroms that take place in that period. And in total, the death toll comes to about 3,000. And then the next wave of pogroms is the one that I'm studying in Ukraine. And that's between 1918 and 1921. And in that wave, there's about 1,500 to 2,000 separate incidents in about 800 different locales, with a total death toll of about 100,000. So it's of an order of magnitude very different from what you're describing. But when we look at them on an individual basis, they really mirror some of the trends that you talk about in Constantine. That on one hand, since there's so many of them, it's easy to say that it's a result of something like anti-Semitism, to just throw that term out there and allow that to describe what's taking place. But when you actually zero in and when you look at on a local level at what's going on, we see a lot of exactly what you're describing. And in the book that I'm writing, I take about 15 of these individual pogroms in various levels of detail and try to drill down on a local level to see exactly what's going on, to disaggregate them. And we see that each one has its own dynamics. And this gets to the point that you're saying they weren't inevitable. There's a whole bunch of contingencies that are taking place, and there's a whole bunch of different factors, different individuals who are playing a role in it, and everyone's a human being making decisions at that moment on whether they're going to participate and to what degree they're going to participate. And much of the murders can be laid on the heads of a few people, whereas masses come in the rioting parts. So, so we can see that how these mundane events lead to violence, how they escalate into violence. And we can also see instances in which mundane events did not lead to violence. Like you described, there's a few moments before, in 1933, before the pogrom breaks out, there's a few other moments that could have escalated into violence and they didn't. And so the question is, what makes some escalate into mass violence and others don't? And there's a whole bunch of theories of crowd behavior that kind of help us, understand this, going back to Le Bon and Freud. I actually like Mark Granovetter, who talks about a threshold of violence, that everybody has a threshold of violence, that there's some people who will be the first person to throw a rock, and that's just kind of their threshold is a threshold of 1. There's other people who will only throw a rock after somebody else has thrown a rock, and there's other people who will throw a rock after 10 people who have thrown a rock, and then there's other people who won't throw a rock until everybody else has thrown a rock. Or who won't raid a store until everybody else has. And I think we see this in your instance, and we also see it in many of the instances that I'm looking at, where it begins with some provocateurs. It begins with people who have an ideological mission that they're trying to impose upon the population. They attack Jews for some particular reason, and then other people join in. And initially, it's usually women and children who are the first to join in, and they kind of go in and they start looting the stores. They, in a way, have the least to lose. They're less likely to be shot doing so. The kids are just kind of having fun. Women are responsible for getting food stuff, so they actually use that as an opportunity. And then gradually, more and more people, then the former prisoners come in, the workers come in, and then at the very end, it's the elite of society. And that's what really most galls the victims, is when they see the people that they regard as, their equivalents, when they see doctors, lawyers, teachers looting as well. And they're the last ones to come in, so you could say that they have the largest threshold. And when you look at each of these pogroms in detail, like you've done, you can also see the background of people. You can see the military background, and you talked about that in Constantine as well, that some of them have military backgrounds. And I think that's significant in my case. My case is taking place right after World War I. So there's a lot of soldiers who have been the army has just sort of disintegrated. The Russian Imperial Army disintegrated. They had previously fought alongside, Ukrainians and Jews had fought alongside each other. The army disintegrates, they go home, there's nothing left to do. The farms are all destroyed. They can't really continue to take up farming again, and so they return to arms and they start to attack their neighbors. I also want to talk about another similarity that I see. You mentioned this in the book, the existential homelessness of the majority population. Jews are driven to seek protection from the very authorities the majority population is fighting against. And I saw that dynamic as well taking place in my Ukrainian example, which in that case, the imperial entity are the Russians instead of the French. And the Ukrainians play a similar role to the Algerians in that they are also a disenfranchised minority. And the Jews are a minority, they're numerically much less than the Ukrainians, but both of them are subject to this imperial Russian regime. And the Jews have actually done, one could say, a better job assimilating into the Russian upper classes. And so this creates a dynamic of tension, particularly in my case after the Russian Revolution takes place, when Jews are able to assimilate more readily into the Bolshevik Party and into the goals of the Russian Revolution. And so that creates a great deal of animosity, which is a very similar root, I think, to what you're describing. It's that notion of being doubly minority, of two vulnerable groups under imperial rule. The minority of those vulnerable groups is seen as having gotten more rights than the majority. I think in your case, it is actually quite true that the minority has more rights than the majority. I think that's verifiably true because they're granted French citizenship. In my case, it's not actually true, but there's a widespread perception that the Jews have been given more rights than the Ukrainians, even though they're a minority. So I think, when we look at the ultimate roots, there's also a great deal of similarity there. And then you also talk about how anti-Semitism is a way of becoming French, of expressing Frenchness when so few other avenues were available. And I think I have the same, I see the same dynamic. Russia, the Russian imperial system was also known for being highly anti-Semitic, and the language of anti-Semitism provides a way of expressing dissent. Even if the dissent isn't directly directed against Jews, it's just a language that they can latch onto. That's a language borrowed from the imperial structure, but allows them to express dissent. And then really finally, I guess, the notion that violence produces the very divisions that were claimed as its primary cause. So you point out that Jews and Muslims actually lived fairly well in Constantine and Algeria before this episode, but after this episode, then they really become antagonistic towards each other. And I think that's a really important point, and it's a point that I have seen as well. And I'm looking at several different stages of pogroms from 1903, or even from 1881 to 1903 and 1918. And at each stage, the violence then further antagonizes, further separates the communities. And I could even go up until 1941, which you also do in a way. And in fact, many of the people, as I said, in my pogroms, there is often somebody who initiates it. There's somebody with an ideological agenda who initiates it. And they are also then usually become hyper-nationalists and usually ally with Nazi Germany, and sometimes return with Nazi Germany in 41 as well. So there's also a move among these Ukrainian nationalists towards Nazi Germany, just like the move that you see Al-Mahdi making. So I think it's populations, we have populations that have little contact with each other, but afterwards, after these episodes, then they become predisposed to violence. Then that predisposition to violence actually becomes a reality that didn't exist before, that was solely a contingency before. So I really thought it's interesting that in different parts of the world, there's these similarities, again, even though mine are much bigger, and there's many more of them. That's there's probably about 200 to 300 pogroms that have at least 24 people killed, and several others that have, in the numbers of 1,000 or so killed in a single pogrom. But yet there's a similar phenomenon. And the overarching question that I had after reading your book was, why were there not other ones of these in Constantine? And so what happened in Constantine, in the cases that I'm looking at, one pogrom begets others, and immediately they spread. And when there's a pogrom in one town, there's one in the next town, and the next town, next town, and it spreads to thousands of them. Whereas in Constantine, that's it. There's then, I would expect it all Algeria to then rise up. My guess is it has something to do with the reaction of the authorities, and that the authorities strictly stamp down on it. Religious authorities seem not to tolerate it. The police don't seem to tolerate it. Whereas in Ukraine, the authorities do tolerate it, although often actually there isn't any authority whatsoever, so there's nobody to tolerate it or not tolerate it. So anyway, those are my thoughts on the comparison with Ukraine, and I can, maybe do you want to respond, or should I open it up to see if there's other questions? And
Why don't we collect some questions from the audience first, and then I can respond as I go?
Okay. Yeah, I'll sit there and then you'll do there. Yeah, okay.
We have microphones also for you guys so if you don't mind, or do you want to take the question? So you need to tell Liz and Kelsey. Okay, I thought it was Derek.
Right, I said, yeah.
This is the question. Is this on? I have to do something?
Just hold it closer to your...
Just hold it close. Yeah, there it is. In the cases where you had the counterexamples, where you have an incident that could have sparked a pogrom and it didn't, versus the places where they spread, is it the presence of these provocateurs with a political agenda that makes the difference? Is there enough data to support that? I'm recalling the ethnic violence in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and there's a film called Before the Rain that's set in Macedonia, where in a kind of mixed Macedonian Albanian community, there is basically a sort of domestic incident. It might involve a rape and a murder. It's not really ethnically based. But one of the characters says to another, just wait till the politicians get here.
Do you want to go first, or you want?
Are we answering? Is that how we're playing, or are we?
Okay.
We'll connect maybe a couple.
Yeah. Okay.
If you don't mind, maybe saying your name and your department.
Hello. This question is mainly directed to Mr. Cole.
Yeah.
Previously, you mentioned that the political reform in Algeria wouldn't have happened anyway, and I'm just interested to know why you think that wouldn't have been possible.
Thanks. I'm Valerie Kivelson from the History Department. I was wondering, Josh, about the Crimea Code, and is there a short, easy answer of why the Jews got in and the Muslims didn't?
Yeah, I can address that a little bit. Maybe I should field a couple of these. So, first of all, the question about previous examples that didn't turn out. For me, this is really the fascinating question. It's actually why I resist the phrase classic pogrom to describe what goes on in Constantine. Maybe my fear is not the word, or my problem is not with the word pogrom, but my problem is with the word classic. That particularly in the regions of the world that Jeff talks about, and that people have studied in the former Pale settlement, there's almost a ritualized quality to these violent events that they break out. They follow a very similar pattern. They start in a similar way. Sometimes there's even almost a carnivalesque. People are out in the streets, you know, kids are playing with Jewish effigies on Easter week, right? And people kind of know their roles, yeah. Right? It's scripted. This is the only major incident of violence like this in Algeria in the interwar period. And it is partly because of the presence of political entrepreneurs, let's call them that, right? People who seek an advantage, a political advantage by escalating the temperature of social reality, by making things more difficult. And what's interesting is there's no shortage of those people in the 1920s, but it doesn't always lead to a big spark. There's something about the political intensity of the 30s, the passivity of the police, the complicity. In my book, I actually think it's the complicity of the local political establishment that makes the difference. And it's a sort of perfect storm. The reason it doesn't happen everywhere else is also related to Constantine's a funny place. Its Jewish minority is bigger than in the other major cities in Algeria. And the French settler population is correspondingly smaller and itself more vulnerable as a kind of minority that is lording over this imperial realm. There's the population of Jews in Oran is only about 7%. In Algiers, it's only about 9%. And it doesn't sound like much, but that difference is you could form a political majority on the local council without Jewish allies in Oran and Algiers, but you couldn't. It was really hard to do it. So you either ran a campaign with Jewish allies or you ran an anti-Semitic campaign against the coalition who were allied with Jews. And that was just how politics worked in the city. And it was something to do with the demographics of the city. But it was the political intensity of the early 1930s. On the question of this is a very good question that you ask. I think the French colonial system in Algeria was doomed to fail because it couldn't find any way of including the population, the formerly excluded populations, without continuing to mark them as different and dangerous in significant ways. It couldn't find a way to give Algerians political representation without hedging their power in so many ways as to make their ability to actually represent their constituency almost impossible. And once a cohort of Muslim politicians appeared, nobody would talk to them, nobody would ally with them, their demands were ignored, and that made it much harder for them to achieve any kind of meaningful. So I think the system was already on its last legs. if these provocations hadn't occurred, I think the system would have failed anyway. I think the mass-based nationalist movement had its own dynamic within a few years. But nevertheless, this event did make everything worse, right? That is true. The Crimea Decree. So the story about why the Jews in Algeria get citizenship and Muslims do not it's partly the complicated story of divide and rule in a colonial context. And it's also related to the politics of the way that the Republic came into existence and the traditions of citizenship in France that emerged from the French Revolution. French Jews got citizenship in 1791, so that when Algeria became part of French civil territory, suddenly Jews in metropolitan France were faced with an anomalous situation that there were two kinds of Jews, right? There were Jews in France who had citizenship and Jews who did not, who remained colonial subjects in Algeria between 1830 and 1870. And so there were efforts to create Jewish organizations that would target the assimilation of Jews already in the 1830s and 40s. They established Jewish consistories. They extend existing Jewish organizations in metropolitan France to Algeria. And then in 1870, when the Republic is created in a moment of national crisis, Adolphe Crémieux is the first minister of justice. He happens to be Jewish, a prominent Republican figure who takes seriously the promise of citizenship that was offered to Jews in 1791. And one of the first things he does is offer citizenship and goes over the head of the settler political establishment who's furious that this happens. They don't want it. But it was to resolve that situation. So it's kind of a specific circumstance. Yeah.
Maybe can I also respond to Herb's question, in particular about why it happens in some places and doesn't in others. And it's not an easy question to answer. There's a lot that's just random, and it just has to do with the people who are there, and if there's an instigator, or if there's not an instigator. You know, if there's one person who is the first person to throw the stone or not, has a lot to do with it. But also the authorities' reaction and what local authorities do, particularly priests. If a priest comes out and quiets everybody down, then things seem to quiet down. I think religious authorities have a great deal of power in these situations, even more than the civil authorities, because the civil authorities are being overthrown, particularly in a revolutionary situation. They have little power, and they often do want peace. They're often advocating for peace. But it's the degree to which the religious authorities are willing to speak out. And then the other is what the troops do. I think in the Constantine pogrom, if we call it a pogrom, what I think the smartest decision they made was probably to keep the troops in the barracks. Because as you point out, there was a fear that the troops would have sided with the Muslims against the Jews, and that would have led to a wide-scale massacre. And that's generally what happens in Ukraine, is they rely upon the troops to put it down, and the troops turn against the Jews. So I think in my cases, if the troops had been kept in the barracks, things probably would have happened very differently. But as soon as you let the troops out of the barracks, they go wild.
So I have a follow-up question to that, Twilight Arif. And I guess my question is really, if that was the case, so what significant cities with large populations of Jews at that time didn't have pogroms, or were there any?
Yeah. There aren't really any large cities that don't have pogroms, but there's a matter of how big they are and when they're stopped and at what level. Yelizavetgrad, for instance, has a relatively small one for a place its size and with that number of Jews. Odessa also, actually, in the 1918 to 1921, has smaller pogroms, but nothing compared to what you would expect. In 1905, one of the biggest pogroms is in Odessa, and an estimated 800 people are killed. And in 1918 to 1921, Odessa remains relatively quiet, and that's largely because the French are there. And the French actually have control of the city, as opposed to any other army that's controlling any other city that really can't control it.
Yeah, the victims in Constantine, they all, or most of them, lived in the more affluent part of town. So my question is, were there any economic or what were the economic factors, real or perceived, in the relationship between the Jewish and the Muslim community?
So it's complicated, and it's very hard to tie together sort of economic discontent to the specific circumstances of August 1934, and I try hard to avoid, historians sometimes, we don't like to describe processes that seem automatic, right? Inter-community violence is not like the weather, or it's not like a hydraulic system where economic pressures build up and then burst forth. Those kinds of explanations are hard, but it's clear that Jews benefited after 1870 from citizenship. They had better educational opportunities. There was a different regime for military service. And by the first decades of the 20th century, Jewish businesses had expanded along many of the new streets that had penetrated the old city. Particularly textile merchants were targeted during the riots. So I think there is an economic component to the resentment that was expressed at certain times. But the line from economic discontent to participating in anti-Jewish violence is not a direct one. And the documents that I have, one of the really interesting documents I had was the local political establishment and the local police were really on the spot after the violence occurred. And so when the investigating commission came in, they asked the prefecture and the police to go back into their records for 3 decades and pull out every incident they could find, which was basically any incident in which a Jewish person was present. And they called this the sort of anti-Semitism files. And I had access to all this, and I went through. So I had, for the 1890s, the period just before the First World War, for the 1920s, and up until the early 1930s. I talk in the book about how hard it is. It's hard to know how selective these documents were and the way that they were shaped. And it's probably true that the police also had an anti-Jewish bias. But in any case, I try and use them for what they can show us. And what they're filled with, as much as they're filled with expressions of resentment, they're also filled with examples of Jewish men and Muslim men who are together every day in the cafe, who know each other quite well. And it's the disputes that are arising out of the normal day-to-day human activities of living in a heterogeneous city that has undergone transformation under the colonial system. In as much as they show episodes of people who don't like each other, they also show evidence of people whose lives are very entangled. Even so, I talked a little bit about Muhammad al-Mahdi's own family background, right? The fact that he has a French grandmother, and that his grandparents and his father are French citizens. He's 3rd generation French citizen by descent, right? It's a very unusual family. Probably only a couple of thousand elite Algerian Muslim families took citizenship in this way. So he's a member of an elite. And likewise, the other person who plays a big role in the instigation of this moment is the drunken Jewish reserve officer who gets in the initial dispute. And everybody in his neighborhood tells a story in the aftermath about his own family background. His father, a Jewish man, apparently died when he was quite small, and everybody in the neighborhood believed that his mother had moved in with a Muslim man afterward, and the story was that his real father was the Muslim man that his Jewish mother had moved in with, right? So once you get close, you realize that the stories are really not so much about crystallized identities that were colliding like this. They were about very complicated relationships that produce a moment of tension and alarm and vulnerability and fear, and it's the aftermath that those categories become dominant. I mean, everybody thinks of themselves as Muslims and Jews, but their lives are intertwined in all these complicated ways. Yeah.
I have a question for Jeff, actually, and that follows up on what you just discussed about your access to sources and Jeff's comment that he envies your situation. So could you talk a little bit about the sources that you do have, and how do you reconstruct the patterns of pogroms, but also the causes? Because Josh's account is very detailed, right? And the police records are extremely, pedantically notes, etc. So I was wondering, in your case, especially when pogroms happen in small towns and villages, and if you also have like church documents, and I don't know, if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So I guess in a way, fortunate for my sources, pogroms were a fairly regular part of life in that part of the world. So the Jewish communities were prepared for what to do and had committees set up that tried to collect information on pogroms in order to prosecute pogrom mongers and in order to remember what happened. So as soon as they started, these central committees sent out letters and flyers to hundreds of communities throughout Ukraine saying, please tell us what happened in your communities. They sent out questionnaires for them to fill out, and they asked rabbis, they asked ordinary people to send the descriptions into the central committee. So most of what I have are victim accounts, and there's tens of thousands of them, tens of thousands of pages, but they're generally one-sided victim accounts of people describing what happened in their town, which they then sent to this Kiev Central Committee that we have the archives of, and actually that Michael helped me go through, my research assistant over there. So that's the main source. And then also there were revolutionary tribunals that punished pogrom perpetrators. The Soviet revolutionary tribunals did not go into as much detail as the police reports. They tended to be much, at least from what I've seen, from what you were able to obtain, they tended to be much quicker in administering justice and didn't require the same level of proof, didn't require the same level of investigation. It was enough to determine that somebody is a counter-revolutionary bandit, is the term that they used, in order to punish them. So we have those sources as well, and then memoirs and things like that. But it's predominantly victim testimonies, and then there's very few actually state investigations because there's not really a state functioning. So we don't have the types of detailed police reports that you have, which really sound fantastic. It's nice to have police, let alone police reports.
Right.
We have time for 2 quick questions, and then we conclude.
Okay, thank you, Pam Ballinger from History. Thanks to Josh and Jeff. And Josh, I'm really looking forward to reading your book. So this is a question, I know probably annoying because there's so many choices to make in a book, but I'm curious, you made a very compelling argument for why we should read this in a French rather than just than solely a colonial Algerian frame. But I'm wondering about what happens if you look at the story in a Mediterranean inter-imperial frame, the notion of this kind of colonial sea. And I'm especially intrigued because this notion of Euro-African fascism and thinking that this is, Al-Mahdi, this is a moment where the Italians and their colony, 1937, Mussolini, declares himself or is declared protector of Islam with the sword of Islam. It's also the rise of anti-Semitism in Italy and its colonies, and this kind of competition. And wondering about, is there a sort of Mediterranean fascism that that Al-Mahdi is linking into, and are there, I know there's many Italians or people of Italian origin in Algeria as well as Tunisia and so on. What would, looking at that Mediterranean frame, how might it shift your story? Maybe for a future article, think about it.
That's a great question. Should I maybe get Keanu's question first before I respond?
And then perhaps when we can both conclude.
Yeah, that's great.
Hi, Keanu, second year in the PhD program in history. Professor Cole, this is a question I'd asked you in a different form when you did your talk in the Department of History. But I'm just curious about the transferability of the concept of provocation. Mm-hmm. And both you and Professor Wilding were talking about these scripts that are enforced to, archetypes of violence in these anthropological settings. That there are patterns, there's certain rituals of violence that explode. I was wondering if you had to generalize, what lessons can we take from provocation as a heuristic or as an ideal type, as a concept like that?
That's a great question. So let me just say really, is it okay if I go first?
Yeah.
Let me just say really quickly in response, there is a Mediterranean frame. And one of the odd things about this event is that lots of people tried to put it in that frame before they knew what had happened on that day, right? So there are lots of people who've said, Well, it's clear that what happened in Constantine was a reflection of what was going on in Palestine at the time, that there were disputes between Muslims and Jews in Jerusalem from the late 1920s on, and what was happening in Constantine is just a continuation and reflection on that. And so I think, so just to give you how I respond to that in the book, I think it's clear that the parallel events that were happening in Palestine were part of the way that the meaning of the Constantine events were interpreted in their aftermath. But before that, I couldn't find much evidence that local people in Constantine were paying attention to what was going on in Palestine. It was only after the event that they made the connection. Likewise, so this has been an impulse of colonial history in recent years to look for transnational collections, and I actually agree with that. I think it's a great thing that we're doing for the writing of history. But in this case, it was really important to just do the local history first, because that was how I figured out the story about al-Mahdi and the implication of the local political establishment. Once that's done, now I think it's the moment to kind of set back and look for connections between. So al-Mahdi does, in fact, make connections. He goes to Berlin in 1945, and he encounters the Mufti from Jerusalem, al-Husseini, who's in Hitler's orbit. And so there are very few Muslims, but there are a few who end up rallying to Hitler at the end. And al-Mahdi's one of them. So it's this tiny group of people who end up, through their engagement in a kind of colonial fascism, drifting towards a kind of vision of Hitler's imperialism. There are other frames, but it was really important for me to get the local first. And I'll just say in response to Keanu, yes, it is transferable. It's not an accident that I finished this book in the run-up to the election of 2016 and watching what happens in a highly polarized political environment, how certain political entrepreneurs take advantage of divisive rhetoric, and how that divisive rhetoric makes it very hard for people to respond in ways that don't end up being perceived as provocations in turn by others. Therefore, yes, I think it's transferable. I want people to think hard about how that works, and I don't have a recipe or a solution to that. But all the time I spent thinking about what was going on in Constantine, I was also thinking about what was going on around me. Yeah.
I don't have anything else to add, but I appreciate the opportunity to think with
Thank
you
you, Jeff,
and to read
too,
the
for
book and to
giving
learn
me
from it.
And the comparative work is only just beginning for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you to both of you, and we look forward to reading both Josh's book and also Jeff next year,
I
hopefully.
look forward to writing it.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.